We were here back in 2016 when I did two similar type of talks along with others. And they have been so pivotal and so many people have watched them that we decided to revamp them but also upgrade them because, hi Sarah and John, because with this kind of material there is always new research that's going on and we've got to keep on top of it. One of the reasons another reason we're doing this is because it went so big on the internet. I think on KT there's about over 300,000 that have watched this talk that I did 3 years ago. So we need to make sure that we keep it up to scratch. So what we're going to do tonight is ask this first question. What really happened with Islam? The birth of it. Now you notice I'm putting what possibly happened. This is not going to be definitive. Next year, I'll be probably changing some of the things I'm saying tonight. Because of the fast-moving, the research that's going on, we need to keep on top of it. That's why I'm saying possibly to begin with. But let's go ahead and see what Muslims have claimed. And all Muslims claim really two things. First and foremost, that Muhammad has been the last and the greatest prophet. Now, Muslims would believe that Islam has always existed. Adam and Eve were Muslims. I don't believe that. Most of you don't believe that. But certainly Muslims would start from that premise. Secondly, they would say that Muhammad received revelations between 610 and 632, that 22-year period. And then he started the Khilafah in 624. Most people assume, therefore, 624 is when Islam began. That's not what Muslims say. But in order to understand Islam, you need to understand this man and the book that was revealed to him, the Quran. Therefore, Islam is the final religion based on Muhammad's life and sayings, the Sunnah, and on the Quran's teaching. So, really, it's a religion of one book and one man. As Christians, we would start from the same paradigm, would we not? We also believe that as Christians, we have an authority called the Bible, and that the Bible points to another man, a bigger man, Jesus Christ. So, as Islam is dependent on one book and one man, so are we dependent on another book and another man. Because of that, we probably understand them better than anybody else. And that's why it's important that we go to that book and that man. Now, I'm not going to do the book tonight. That will be tomorrow night. In some ways, what I'm going to do tomorrow night is a lot more controversial and a lot more explosive and in many ways a lot more exciting. So let's start with the man. Let's start with Muhammad. What we need to do, we want to investigate both the Quran and Muhammad and see if indeed the Muslims are correct. Let's, for this study, look at Muhammad and the emergence of his religion called Islam. When you have studied Muhammad, this is the classical account. This is the only account that you're ever told. This is the account that you get in your schools, in your colleges, on university campuses. Anywhere you have studied Islam, this is the account you get. So let's go through it real quickly. Every Muslim, everybody knows that Muhammad was born in 570, that he started receiving these revelations in the Hira cave in 610, and that from 610 to 622, he received the Meccan revelations, roughly speaking, the second half of the Quran. In 621, he was woken up in the middle of the night, told to get on the back of a winged horse called the Burak, and he flies up from Mecca up to Jerusalem, and at Jerusalem, he then flies up the seven heavens and meets Allah. Tells him to pray 50 times a day. He then comes down 2 heavens to the 5th heaven where he meets Moses, who says there's too many prayers, see if you can bring it down. So he bounces back and forth between the 7th and the 5th heaven and brings the prayers for 50, 45, 30, 15, 10, down to 5 prayers. After which Moses says that's fine enough, and then he comes back down to Jerusalem and then returns to Mecca. That happens in 621. 622, he then moves from Mecca to Medina, known as the Hijrah, which means the Exodus, with possibly between 80 to 200 followers. It depends on which account you're going to read. And then from 622 to 632, he is receiving these Medinan revelation, which would be the first half of the Quran. In 630, he walks into Mecca, conquers it without firing a shot. 632, he dies suddenly like most people, but according to some traditions, he was poisoned. At that point, the Quran had not yet been written down. The Quran that we have in our hands today did not exist at that time. It was memorized by many of his companions. Parts of it were written on bone, stone. Some of it was written on pieces of bark, but it was not written in a codex form. So 632, he dies. Abu Bakr takes over for 2 years. He dies peacefully. Umar then takes over for another 10 years, and he is killed. From 634 to 644, Uthman, the third caliph, takes over as the caliph, and he lives for about another 12 years before he is killed. And then Ali, the adopted son of Muhammad, has the last 5 years, 656 to 661. That is the classical account. Has anybody heard any other account besides this? Now, I'm just giving you the bare bones. This is just the skeleton. But that's it. That's all we've ever been told. That's all you're ever going to hear. Now, here's the problem. Everything I've just told you about takes place in this red period, this red dotted era, okay? Well, a little bit more. I did add up until the time of the end of what they call the Rashidun period, the time of the rightly guided caliphs. But everything we're talking about happens here. Now, how many of you assume that what I've just told you is written down by people who were living in that time period? Or better yet, how many would you have wanted everything I've just told you to have been written down from that same time period? Probably all of you, right? Of course. You would hope that eyewitness people who had seen Muhammad, who had seen what he did, who had heard what he said, had written down while he was living. Correct? Like we have with Jesus Christ. Nothing that I have told you in the last 10 minutes comes from that red period at all. In fact, nothing that I have just told you comes from the same century that Muhammad lived in. It doesn't come until this era here. In fact, the first thing we have of any biography of Muhammad is this man here, Ibn Ishaq. He died in 765. Muhammad died in 632. 130 years later. But we don't have any of Ibn Ishaq's material. We are dependent on this man here, Ibn Hisham. This is the first man to write down what he said. What he didn't like, he just threw away, only retained what he wanted. And so the first time we hear of any biography that's written down on any extant form that we can look at today is Ibn Hisham. Look at the date, 833. Do your maths. That's 200 years after the fact. Now that's just the Siratu Rasulullah, which would be the biography of Muhammad. As far as the sayings of Muhammad, which are much greater, much more prolific, you need to go to this man over here, Al-Bukhari. He is the first to write down the hadith. That's the sayings of the Prophet. Look at his date, 870. That's 240 years later. Everything that comes after that, in fact, they all come after that. After Al-Bukhari comes Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, Tirmidhi. They all come after 870. So those are two of the genre of what we know as the Islamic traditions. If you want to go to a third genre, the tafsir, which would be the commentaries, you need to go to this man here, Al-Tabari. He died in 923. He is also the first to write what we call as the Tariq, which would be the histories. So anything that comes, that is written after by Tabari, like Baidawi, Zamakhshari, Suyuti, they all come after 923, which means everything we know about Muhammad, everything we know about how Islam began, everything we know about how the Quran was put together, all that you have been told your whole life does not come from the period it happened over here. It all comes from this period here, 200 to 300 years later. Does that bother any of you? It should bother all of you. Because that suggests, or that doesn't just suggest, that means that everything we know about this man, about Islam, how it began, does not come from any eyewitnesses whatsoever. It comes from people who are writing hundreds of years later and hundreds of miles away. Now, there's the names right there. 765, Ibn Ishaq. We don't have it. No extant manuscript. Ibn Hisham, Al-Bukhari, Al-Tabari. Those are the main, the primary beginners of each one of those. Let's look at Jesus Christ. Everything we know about Jesus Christ, did people actually write down what he did and what he said from the same time period he was living? No, not while he was living. How about right after? Yes. Look at the Sirah of Jesus, the biography of Jesus. Who wrote the biography of Jesus? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Am I correct? And 3 of them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, wrote before 60 AD. Jesus died in 33 AD. So within 30 years, you already have 3 biographies. John would have been written later, about 90 AD. So within 60 years, you have 4 biographies about Jesus Christ, 2 of them by eyewitnesses who actually saw him do what he did. What about the hadith of Jesus, the sayings of Jesus? In your New Testament, in the gospel account, whenever it's red letter, that would be the sayings. Am I correct? So there's the hadith of Jesus written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Again, so within 30 to 60 years, all the hadith of Jesus have been written down. That means with this, what Jesus did and what he said were written down within 60 years of his death. 2 of them by eyewitnesses, and the other 2 got it from the eyewitnesses. What about the tafsir? Well, the tafsir, the commentaries, would be Paul's letters. And they would have been written within 16 to 20 years, well, or 25 years after Christ's death. Even earlier than the gospel accounts. In the Tahrikh, the histories, the book of Acts, written by Luke, between 52 AD and 62 AD, so within 20 to 30 years, you have already the Tahrikh. So all 3 genres of what we know as the Sirah of Jesus, the Hadith of Jesus, the sayings of Jesus, the commentaries on what Jesus did, and the history of the early church were written within 50 to 60 years. Compare that with Islam, who don't have anything for 200 years, and theirs all written down from 200 to 300 years. What that says to me is that if I wanted to know anything about Jesus Christ, and all I have is what Islam has, I would know nothing about him until the 3rd century. How would I defend him? How would any of us defend Jesus if it was that late? Thank God we don't have the same problem. Isn't it great to know? We know who he was, we know what he said, we know where he went, we know where he died. All this we can pretty much be assured of. And yet Islam has nothing before 833. How many for you, is this the first time you've heard this? So you're not taught this in your schools. No one gives you any dates. This is the big lie that we've never been told, and that's why we're doing this here at Kensington Temple. You need to know this. And Muslims, I know Muslims are going to be watching this. It's going to be put up on YouTube, and I'm talking to Muslims specifically. You've got to deal with this, because if this is the case, then I'd like to know how is it you can defend your prophet and how you can defend your religion. Now, the 21st century scholars, this is their criticism. Concerning these late dates, Humphrey says, Islam as we know it did not exist in the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years. Andrew Rippon and Leicester said the Quran probably was not revealed to one man in 22 years, but likely evolved over a period of 50 to 100 years. Therefore, the conclusion, according to Cook and Robinson, is that the history of Islam, at least from the time of the Caliph Abdul Malik, hold on to that name, going to talk quite a bit about that tonight, and before is a later fabrication. Now that's quite a mouthful right there. What they're saying is almost everything that you have heard, everything you saw on that classical account about Muhammad is a lie. It's a fabrication. How am I going to prove that? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first ask their questions. And these are legitimate questions. These are the same questions that were asked about our Bible back in the 1800s when they're in Tübingen in Germany. Wellhausen was saying, how do we know who Abraham was? How can we know who Moses is? No one was writing at that time. None of this is eyewitness account. Moses was not there when Abraham was living. Remember those questions? How do we even know that Moses wrote it? Remember the documentary hypothesis? All of this, redacted criticism, source criticism, all these criticisms that I'm going to be using tonight were first used on the Bible. And that's why I can use them tonight. Because those of us who've studied the Bible, this is our bread and butter. This is what we're used to. We know these kind of criticisms. You would not have historical criticism without biblical criticism. Everything I'm going to introduce tonight was created on the Bible. And the Bible has answered every one of those criticisms. That's why I can stand up here and show you what we're now going to ask. And these are the questions. Why in the world did it take so long to write down his biography? Why were people not writing it down as he lived? Muhammad's biography I'm talking about. Why did it take so long to write down what he said? Could people not read or write? Remember, they controlled, by 652, they controlled Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo. Are you telling me nobody could read and write in those 5 cities? By 685, by the time Abdul Malik comes to power, that we're going to really zero in on tonight, from Spain in the west all the way to India in the east, that whole area was under their jurisdiction. You're telling me that nobody from Spain to India could read or write? Please. There was an entire library that was destroyed in Alexandria in the 5th century. No Muslim would dare admit that nobody could read or write. So where did these 9th century biographies, 833, 870, the 10th biography, the 10th century compilers, 923, where did they get their material from? And should we trust it if it's so late? More than that, if we don't trust it, why not go back to the 7th century and see what actually happened? That's what any historian should do. And that's what we're going to do tonight. I don't trust it. I hope you don't trust it. And those who are watching shouldn't be trusting it. So let's go back and see what actually happened. Now, let's just take a look at this map here. As you can see what I'm going to be looking at. So this brown area and the yellow area of this direction all the way to the Mongol Empire on this side, that whole swath of land was under Islamic control by 685. Okay, 661, the brown area was under their control. So what we're going to do is now unpack that area of the world, and we're going to see what we find. But I'm going to use these scholars. And these are the scholars that are, well, in my area of the world, they are well known. These are the best in the world. Dr. John Wansbrough here at School of Oriental and African Studies, he was the one that really blew this whole question open back in the 1970s by writing 2 books, one called Quranic Studies and the other called Sectarian Milieu. Dr. Gerard Haunting was my professor when I was studying this in 1994. 1994, that makes me feel old. That was 25 years ago I was studying this. So I've known this material for over 25 years. This is not new material. This is old material. What I'm going to be introducing later on tonight, it will be new. Dr. Patricia Corona, who is a student of Dr. Wansbrough, got her doctorate at School of Oriental and African Studies, went to Oxford University and wrote one of the most devastating books on Meccan trade. I'm going to be using some of her material on Mecca. She got a death threat for writing that book in 1987, had to move to Cambridge University, and then finally lived the rest of her life at Princeton. She just died about 2 years ago. She reads and writes 15 languages, all archaic languages. How many here can read and write 15 languages? Archaic languages that no longer exist. Can you see why she's so formidable and why she's so dangerous? Dr. Andrew Rippon out of Calgary, he is the one that probably has taken this very difficult material and put it down to layman's terminology. Dr. Robert Hoyland out of Oxford University, he reads and writes 18 languages. And that's why you have to listen to these people when they speak. Dr. Yehuda Nevo, who comes out of Jerusalem, University of Jerusalem, wrote the Crosswords to Islam, where he did much of the germinal work on looking on the earliest inscriptions, the Arabic inscriptions, and that's why we're going to use him tonight. And then the German school, these are all Germans here, Dr. Luning, Dr. Quinn, Dr. von Bothmer, Oleg. I'll be using more of them tomorrow on the manuscript evidence. They're the best in the world when it comes to Arabic manuscript evidence. But there have been 3 books and 2 new documentaries which are paving the way. Now, some of these you already know about. One is Tom Holland. Do you all know who Dr. Tom Holland is? Does anybody, no one knows who Dr. Tom Holland is? Shame on you. He is one of your best historians. In fact, just yesterday, I went to see him talk. There is a new book coming out tomorrow, which you all need to buy. It's called Dominion. Dr. Tom Holland has really come home. This is his testimony, you might say. And what he has done, he's gone through and he's shown how almost everything that we consider to be important or dear here in the West is because of Christianity. Our politics, our social values, our moral values are all because of Christianity. Amazing book. But he's not a Christian. He says he's very clearly, he didn't say that he was a Christian. He's just so indebted to what Christianity has given the West. But he was the one that wrote In the Shadow of the Sword back in 2012. That same year, in August the 28th, he put a documentary, just a 90-minute documentary, where he went through the major areas of the book, but he didn't come to any conclusions. But because it was so shocking to the Muslim community, when they tried to show that documentary on Channel 4 a second time, they couldn't do it. The Muslims objected so much. And you'll see why. If you have a chance, it's still up on Channel 4, go see it. It's only 90 minutes long, because it gives you an overview of some of the things we're going to be talking about tonight. But the man that I really want to highlight tonight is this man here. Dan Gibson. Dan Gibson has done what every historian should do. He actually went to the locations. In every place that he studied, he actually went there physically, and he did the measurements in situ. And between 1979 to 2004, he actually went from mosque to mosque to mosque to mosque to find out where the Qibla directions, that means the direction of the prayer, is for all those mosques. He first started out with a book in 2003 called The Nabateans. Then he did another book called Quranic Geography. This laid open his thesis. He then did The Sacred City, and then just in 2017, 2 years ago, he came out with Early Islamic Qiblas, probably the most controversial book. If you want to see him today, you can go up on Talking with Dan Gibson up on YouTube, and you can look at his videos. Go look at them, because there he's answering all of the critics' questions. But what's most important is I want to start by giving you the conclusions, their conclusions. Now, in some ways I'm going backwards, but that's okay. We're going to now prove these conclusions. And these are the conclusions they've come up with concerning Islam. Number one, the first Arab inscription referencing Muhammad is in 691. Stop and think that through. If Muhammad died in 632, what did they do for 60 years? Who knew this man? And why is it from Arab sources we cannot find any reference to this man? Outside of Arab sources we can find him. The Doctrine of Iacobi in 634 refers to him. The Chronicles of Sabaeus in 660 talk about him. But not within Arab sources, and he's supposed to be supposedly is an Arab. Nothing until 691. The first reference to the name Muslim is not till the 690s. So what did they call themselves? Because these Arabs were conquering Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo. These 5 cities were conquered by 652. But who and what were they? And what did they refer to themselves? Well, they use other names. They call themselves Saracens. That's the name that the Europeans gave. They call themselves Hagarines because they were in the line of Hagar. They call themselves Ishmaelites because they were in the line of Ishmael through Hagar. They call themselves Maghreb because they came from the Maghreb, the area they came from. And they use the word Mahajurun, which means people of the Hijr, people of the Exodus, people who are nomadic. Those are the words they used for themselves. Nowhere can we find any reference to people called Muslims. Yet these were the first Muslims, we've been told. What happened? Why is it they didn't call themselves that? Hold on. The first reference to Islam is not till 691 on the Dome of the Rock, and this is the most devastating. The first reference to the city of Mecca is not till 741. Ooh, 741. You'll see why that's significant. And then the first biography of Muhammad is not, within any Islamic sources, is not till 833, as I said earlier. So, let's start with the first problem, geography. When Dan Gibson looked at the Quran, he noticed that there were about 65 geographical names. 9 of them were listed. Yet when he looked at the geographical locations, he realized that none of them made any sense. This prophet, but that's fascinating. When you look at the Quran, you will see that the prophet is not given a name except for 4 times. Only 4 times will you see Muhammad's name in the Quran. Jesus is referred to 93 times. What does that say as far as importance? So it refers to this prophet who lives in a settlement, who lives in the prophet's place. But it doesn't give a name to the place except for once. In chapter 48, verse 24, it refers to Mecca. Is that not confusing? If this prophet is so important, and if the place is so important, why in the world was it not referred to? This prophet has an awful lot of contact with 3 different groups of people. One are the people from Ad, which would be the Ur, or Uz as we know it in the Bible. 23 times he has contact with them. He has contact with people from Thamud, who would be the Nabateans as we know them. And 7 times he has contact with people from Midian, who are the Midianites. Those are well known in the Bible. So they're well-known peoples, but here's the problem. Take a look at where they are. They're all up here. Mecca's way down here. There's 600 miles between Mecca and where these people lived. Unless he had a helicopter, how could he get up going 600 miles up and back down again the same day, 1,200 miles, to have these daily contacts with these people? Whoever wrote the Quran obviously did not know their geography. Or perhaps Muhammad wasn't in Mecca. Hold on to that thought. When we do a comparison with the Bible, let's just take the Gospel of Luke, which is probably the best one to compare with, because the Gospel of Luke has lots of geographical locations. About 110 geographical locations in the Gospel of Luke, 65 geographical locations in the Quran. When you look at the 65 geographical locations in the Quran, 9 places are named. All of them are 600 miles too far north. They're all in the wrong place. When you look at the 110 geographical locations in Luke, which is much older than the Quran, by 600, I would say 7, possibly 800 years, it has 31 places named right where they belong. All of them are in the right place. Oh, that's why you do a comparative, and there's no comparison. Now, if you have a problem with geography, then you're going to have a problem with Mecca. We have to come to Mecca. What do we know about Mecca? Well, it's only referred to once in chapter 48, as I said earlier, verse 24, and doesn't really say much, other than the fact that it's in a valley. There is the reference to Bakka, which is in chapter 3, verse 96. Could that be Mecca? The problem is it doesn't have the same characters. It doesn't have the same consonants. And for those of you who know Arabic, you cannot impose Mecca onto Bakka, even though it sounds similar in English. So what's the importance of Mecca? Well, what we know about Mecca is that it is according to the traditions. Now notice, I'm putting the word Mecca in every one of these verses. When you read those verses, Mecca's not there. It always says the place of the prophet or the settlement, assuming that's where the prophet lived. But it doesn't even give you the name of the prophet. Only 4 times is the prophet's name even referred to in the Quran. So I'm putting Mecca there because Muslims believe that's Mecca. But what we do know from what the Quran tells us, that it's the first sanctuary appointed for mankind, was that time it says Bakka in chapter 3, verse 96. Mecca is the mother of all settlements in chapter 6 and also chapter 42. It's where Adam and Eve were sent to in chapter 7, verse 24. They're up in space in the Garden of Eden, and when they're thrown out of the Garden of Eden, up in space, they're thrown down to Mecca, which suggests it would be the oldest city in the history of mankind, because you can't get any city older than Adam and Eve. Am I correct? Cities where people lived. There were no people before Adam and Eve. So that would suggest it's the first settlement for all of mankind, according to chapter 7, verse 24. It's where Abraham lived in chapter 21, verse 51 to 71. He is there. I had no idea Abraham lived in Mecca, but according to the Quran, he is there. So in 1900 BC, it better exist. Otherwise, where's Abraham? Mecca was where Muhammad was born, according to the traditions. Not the Quran, but the traditions, in 622. It was a center of the Qibla in 624, chapter 2, verse 145 to 9 to 150. Qibla was changed from Jerusalem down to Mecca. So here you have a problem, because it's obvious then that according to Surah 2, that this Qibla, that means the dress of prayer, is redirected from Jerusalem down to Mecca. So there, that is 624. So by 624, every mosque in the world should be facing Mecca. And that would mean every mosque, because Islam had not yet moved. It only began in 624. So it had not yet moved out of Medina. Yet we have only one reference to Mecca in the entire Quran, and that's in chapter 48. Now, what do we know about Mecca? Well, there's quite a bit we know from the traditions. What the traditions tell us is that it has very little vegetation. This place of the prophet is in a valley and has a parallel valley. It has a stream. It has ruins. Possibly the pillar of salt is right outside the city. It has fields. It has trees, grass, fruit, clay, loam. It has olive trees. And it also has mountains overlooking the Kaaba. So that's what the traditions tell us. Yet when you look at Mecca, it has none of that. Mecca is the most barren place on earth. It doesn't have any streams. It only has one well called the Zamzam well. There can't be any olives there because, as everybody knows, olives only grow around the Mediterranean, 600 miles further north. No olives grow south of the Mediterranean. Mecca is 600 miles too far south. So all these references to this vegetation, green vegetation, make no sense for such a barren place. Let's look at the maps. Here's a facsimile of Arab trade routes. Where the question mark is where Mecca should be. It's not there. Here's another one, another facsimile. Where the question mark is, it's not there. That's a trade route map. Let's look at some actual maps. Here's a map from the 6th century. Mecca is not on that map. It should be where that red question mark is. A 7th century map. Mecca is not on that map either. Here's another 7th century map. It should be where the question mark is. It's not there. Still missing. And another 7th century map. Just non-existent. Now, to understand the importance of Mecca, as Muslims tell us, you need to know why it became important. You need to know why it became a hub of trade. And a man who helped them out was known as Montgomery Watt. Montgomery Watt came up with what we know today as the trade route theory back in the last century. And he said, in order for Mecca to be important, all the trade that used to come from India and further afield from China, they could go up here to the north because of all the mountains. You had the Himalayas and you had the Hindu Kush. So they had to bring them down to the west coast of India, and they had to go across the Arabian Sea over to the Persian Gulf. They went up the Persian Gulf, and from there they went over to the Mediterranean Sea, because that's where all the trade had to get to the Mediterranean. But then there were two great kingdoms, the Sassanians, who were the Sassanid kingdom, which are the Persians, and the Byzantines, who were up there. And these two kingdoms were starting to war in the 5th century. And as they warred back and forth, that shut down the trade going through the Persian Gulf from the 5th century on. So the trade had to go somewhere. It couldn't go this way through the mountains. It couldn't go through the Persian Gulf. So according to Montgomery Watt, this is what happened. The trade was redirected down south across the Arabian Sea over to Aden, right down here, circled in black. And from Aden, it then went right up the western plateau all the way to Gaza in the north. Now, it didn't follow as direct a line as that. It wiggled all over the place, but it went basically up the western plateau. That's the trade route theory. Dr. Patricia Corona, who reads and writes 15 languages, looked at that, and she saw a problem. In fact, she saw two problems. Here's the first problem. Let's zero in on that western plateau. So here's Aden down here in the south, and this is the trade route, this green line. It comes to Taif right here. And then suddenly it jogs down to Mecca. There's Mecca, about 1,000 meters down. It's not on the sea, that's just the name, but it's right here, about 50 miles inland. It has to go down to Mecca, and then it has to come back up to get to Yathrib, right there. Can you see it? It takes a detour. And then from there, it then goes on up to Gaza in the north. Now, do any of you see a problem with that? She saw it immediately. She says, why had no one noticed this? Mecca is not on the trade route. It makes no sense to come down to a city that could not accommodate any caravans, could not accommodate any camels. It has no water, it has no greenery. So why is it part of the trade route? Then there's a second problem. Why would you take trade across the sea here to Aden and then unload all of the goods here in Aden to then go 1,250 miles, let's go back, 1,250 miles overland up to Gaza when you have a waterway? Why don't you just take it up the waterway? She found that if you take a ton of goods just this 50 miles by land, it would be the same cost as going 1,250 miles by sea, which is the Dead Sea, the Red Sea you see going up here. So, the Red Sea. Can you see why she brought this problem up? That's why today, even today, when you look at goods that come from China or Japan, they all come by ship, don't they? Because it's the cheapest way to always send goods, because all you need is wind. You don't need anything else. So she decided to go and check this out, and that's why she wrote her book, Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam, in 1987. And she went back to the original documents. Remember, she reads and writes 15 languages, so she can read all these languages in their mother tongue, and she found that there was no trade whatsoever up the Western Plateau. The only trade that went up the Western Plateau was milk and leather, and all the trade was coming this direction. It came further south. It did not go to Aden. It went right up the Red Sea, and what was most important, this city was in charge of all the trade, Adulis, which is here in Eritrea. The Ethiopians, the Eritreans, controlled all the trade because they were people who were on boats. Their names are found all over the west coast of India. The Arabs never were involved in that trade because the Arabs were mainly caravanners. They went through the desert. That's why you don't find coastal cities on the western coast of Arabia until modern day. So, destroyed that theory in one fell swoop. And then she decided to find out where she could find any reference to the city of Mecca. Now remember, she reads and writes 15 languages, so she went to all the languages. She went, let me just show you back here. She went over here to Ctesiphon, which is up here. Ctesiphon, modern-day Baghdad, and she found out that people in the Sassanid Empire had come down here to Yathrib, and they had found silver mines here in Yathrib, and they had built those silver mines. Well, that's just northeast of Mecca, and yet they knew nothing about this place, no reference whatsoever to this place called Mecca. So she went from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, all the way up until the 7th, up until the 8th century, and the first reference she could find for Mecca is the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius Continuata Byzantia Arabica, 741. Muhammad died in 632. Abraham was supposedly there in 1900 BC. Adam and Eve were there from the very beginning of time. And yet we don't find any reference on it until 741 AD. That's 110 years after Muhammad's death. No one had heard about this place. It does not appear on any map until 900 AD. Can you see the problem, folks? Are you following this? This is devastating. So let's look at modern Mecca today. There is the Royal Clock Tower, the 4th highest building in the world. It's now there. They want to make that as Meccan Mean Time to eradicate Greenwich Mean Time. That's why it looks very much like Big Ben on there on the left. That's what Mecca's going to look like. Those are the future plans. It's going to be all cemented over. They're going to build 62 skyscrapers all around the Kaaba there. When you look today, you will see that there are cranes. They're just basically what they're doing is they're just digging down and down. Now, whenever you build a skyscraper, you have to dig deep foundations, don't you? And all over the world, here in London as well, any major city, whenever large buildings are built, they dig into the ground. And who comes immediately when they dig in the ground? The archaeologists come. Why? Because the archaeologists know that the further you dig in the ground, the more you find artifacts. And as you find those artifacts, they give them to the archaeologists, they set up a museum, and they recreate the history of the city by looking at those artifacts. That's why we know most about the cities, because of the diggers. They need the diggers to do the digging, and they also need to be able to be given those artifacts. And that's why they have come to all these cranes. They've come to where they're doing all the digging. And guess what they found? Not a thing. Nothing has been found, proving Mecca has no history. What's fascinating is they're now cementing over Muhammad's birthplace, and they're cementing over his wife's house. Why would they be cementing over all these important places? Of course, unless they are trying to hide the evidence. They know what we now know. There is no history for this city. So if you have a problem with Mecca, you're going to have a problem with the Qibla. Because everybody knows that you have to pray 5 times a day. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, you have to face Mecca. Am I correct? You have to face that square building right there called the Kaaba. So, how do you find the Qibla? Well, you can do it by going to any mosque, you'll find the mihrab. Or you can go to my hotel room that I was in Kuala Lumpur there in Malaysia, and there's an arrow on the hotel wall to show you where the Qibla is. Or you can get it on an app on your phone. But you have to be able to know where Mecca is anywhere in the world, and that's why today everybody follows the Qibla. According to chapter 2, verse 143 to 150, the Qibla was changed in 624, but it doesn't say from where. Now, archaeology supports this change, but interestingly, not from Jerusalem to Mecca, as Muslims suggest, but someplace much further north, and much, much later. So, where is it? Well, back about 100 years ago, back in 1905, there were 2 researchers called Creswell and Fehravardi, and they were digging around 3 of the old, in fact, considered to be the oldest mosques known at that time in 1905. 2 of them were in what is today Iraq, and 1 was in Egypt. The one in Egypt was Fustat Mosque, which is just the garrison town outside of Cairo, and the 2 in Iraq were Wasit and the Kufa Mosques. And as they dug down to the floor plans, they came to the original floor plan. When they got to the original floor plan, they noticed that the Qibla wall in those 2 mosques, in Wasit and Kufa, were facing west. When they got to the Fustat Mosque, and they got to the original floor plans, they noticed the Qibla wall was facing east. So over here in the east, they were facing west. Here in the west, they're facing east. They should have been facing south to Mecca. They were off, completely off. Now, they mentioned it, they just said it, and they didn't come to any conclusions. They said, isn't it curious? That's 1905. According to the documentary evidence, we know that Jacob of Edessa, writing in 705 in the 8th century, he refers to the Maghreb saying, so from all this it is clear that it is not to the south that the Jews in the Maghreb here in the regions of Syria pray, but towards Jerusalem or the Kaaba, the patriarchal places of their races. So where in the world were they praying? This is where Dan Gibson comes in. And this is where he's going to help us out. Because Dan Gibson is an archaeologist. In other words, he spent his whole life, his whole career for 25 years, from 1979 to 2004, living amongst the Bedouin, going to where they are, learning their languages, going to where their mosques were, and physically going to every one of the mosques. He went to almost between 100 to 200 mosques. He's the first one to go to these mosques, and he went to see where the Qibla walls were in all of these mosques. And you'd like to know where, wouldn't you? We're going to take a break there, about 10 minutes. Then we're going to come back and we're going to find out what he found. And you're going to love to see what he's come up with.